You learn a lot about a man when you're the one holding a straight razor to his throat. Not in a threatening way, of course. It's about trust. It's the quiet intimacy of the chair, a little island of worn leather and polished chrome in the middle of a world that never stops shouting. My shop, Sal's, is a holdout from another era, sandwiched between a sterile juice bar and a yoga studio that smells faintly of sanctimony and sweat. The floor is original black and white tile, worn smooth in the pathways between the three chairs. The mirrors are vast and honest, showing you more than just the back of your head. They show you the wear and tear of the city, the slow erosion of time on a human face. A man sits down. The cape goes on, a crisp snap of cotton that signals a ceasefire. And for half an hour, the noise outside, the blare of taxi horns on Lexington, the incessant chirp of phone notifications, the nagging anxieties that chew at the edges of a man's peace. It just fades. He's looking at himself in the mirror, and I'm looking at him. We're both seeing the same face, but we're reading different stories. I see the lines of exhaustion bracketing his mouth that he's trying to ignore, the faint, almost imperceptible tremor in his hand as he compulsively checks his phone before surrendering it to the countertop. I see the flicker of raw fear in his eyes when he talks about a business deal teetering on the edge of a cliff, or the subtle unconscious softening around his mouth when he mentions his wife, a name spoken like a prayer. I'm a barber, see? My name is Sal. Not a therapist, not a priest, but sometimes, in the warm, scented air of the shop, thick with the aromas of bay rum, talc, and hot lather, the line gets blurry. The low, steady hum of the clippers is a fine substitute for a confessional screen, and the secrets men tell their mirrors are often the truest ones they have. They confess to the man they wish they were, or the man they're afraid they've become. Arthur Finch was my Tuesday, 4:30 p.m. For 12 years, regular as a heartbeat, as reliable as the tides. You could set your watch by him. He'd walk in, pushing the glass door with its peeling gold leaf lettering that read, Sales Barbershop, EST 1958, and a small bell, a relic my father installed, would jingle, announcing his arrival. His tailored suit, usually a deep charcoal or a formidable navy, would still be crisp at the end of a long day, smelling faintly of an expensive cologne, something with bergamot and cedar, and the clean metallic scent of success. He wasn't loud about his money, not like some of the new money tech boys from the startups colonizing the neighborhood. They treat my chair like a throne and talk about their stock options and seed rounds like they've personally discovered fire, their voices bouncing off the tiled walls with an unearned confidence. They want fades that are mathematically precise and talk about disrupting industries, including, one of them once told me, the antiquated grooming space. I just nod and keep my lines clean. Arthur had a quiet confidence, a solidity, like one of the magnificent buildings he designed. He'd built an architectural firm from the ground up with his best friend, David Geller, Finch and Geller. Their names were etched onto brushed steel plaques on half the new, respectable buildings downtown, monuments in glass and steel to a friendship and a partnership that everyone envied. They didn't just build skyscrapers. They built a legacy. Arthur once told me how they started in a shoebox office over a bakery in Queens with a leaky radiator and a shared drafting table. He'd spoken of it with a fond smile, the memory of the struggle as valuable as the eventual triumph. David was the genius with the numbers, the physics, he had said. I was the dreamer, the one who saw the shape of things in the sky. We needed each other. We still do. He had the life that looked perfect on paper, a life so meticulously curated it could have been a magazine spread. The brilliant career, the beautiful wife, Isabel, a woman with a laugh like wind chimes on a summer porch, and a grace that seemed to make rooms brighter just by her entering them. Arthur spoke of her with a kind of gentle, wondering reverence, as if he still couldn't quite believe his luck. He'd tell me about the small garden she kept on their terrace overlooking Central Park, how she could coax stubborn heirloom roses, a notoriously difficult variety called Etoile de Hollande, to bloom in the hostile city air. She has a gift for making beautiful things grow in impossible places, he once said, his eyes soft in the mirror. They didn't have kids of their own, a quiet sadness he only ever hinted at, a closed door in the otherwise immaculate, light-filled house of his life. It was a brief shadow that would cross his face when he saw a father and son getting haircuts together in the shop, a momentary dimming of his internal light before he'd blink and it was gone. I remember one Saturday afternoon, a man was in my chair, his young son, maybe 6 or 7, sitting on the booster seat in the next chair over, getting a trim from my colleague, Marco. The boy was chattering away about his t-ball game, and the father was beaming. Arthur had been waiting, reading a journal, and I saw him lower it just enough to watch them in the mirror. The look on his face wasn't envy, not exactly. It was a profound hollow ache, a glimpse into a room he'd never get to enter. He saw me looking, and he just gave a small, tight smile and went back to his reading. But that void in his life was filled, it seemed, by his godson, Leo. Leo was David and his wife Eleanor's boy, and Arthur was utterly, completely devoted to him. Arthur was a man who seemed to have meticulously constructed a perfect life, like one of his own intricate blueprints. Everything was in its right place, every angle measured, every joint seamless. When he sat in my chair, our talk was an easy, comfortable rhythm, the familiar cadence of a long-standing acquaintance. The market's volatility, the hopeless state of the Knicks, the perpetual trouble with the city council over zoning permits. He'd ask about my daughter, Sophia, and her college applications, his brow furrowed with genuine interest. He remembered her name, remembered she wanted to study marine biology, even remembered the specific college in California she was dreaming of. "She'll get in, Sal," he'd say with absolute certainty. "A girl with that kind of passion, the world opens doors for them. You tell her if she needs any recommendation letters, anyone to call, just say the word." That's the kind of man he was, attentive, present. He had this easy, genuine warmth about him, a smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the room, that your small concerns were, for that moment, the most important thing in the world. But when he talked about Leo, the warmth would turn into a radiant, incandescent glow. He wasn't just a godfather. He was a second father, the fun one, the co-conspirator. He'd pull out his phone, his whole face transformed by a love so pure and fierce it was almost startling to witness. "Look at this kid, Sal," he'd say, his voice thick with pride, and he'd scroll through a gallery of moments, a digital testament to his adoration. Leo at a Yankees game, a mitt swallowing his small hand, Arthur's arm slung proudly around his shoulder, both of them squinting into the sun with identical grins. Leo, age 10, holding up a shimmering fat trout on a fishing trip to the Catskills with Uncle Arthur, his face a mask of triumphant glee. Arthur had described that day in detail, how they'd gotten up before dawn, the mist rising off the creek, the quiet shared between them as they waited for a bite, a silence more profound and connecting than any conversation. Leo, a teenager now, all limbs and awkward grace, grinning from behind a gleaming drum kit that Arthur had bought him, the one David and Eleanor had expressly forbidden. "They said it was too loud," Arthur had chuckled. "I told them that was the entire point. A boy needs to make some noise." He loved that boy as if he were his own flesh and blood. Maybe, I used to think, even more. Sometimes the love you choose, the love you build deliberately, is stronger, more potent than the love you're simply given by the accident of biology. He's got a better arm than David ever did, he'd laugh, a rich, full-throated sound that filled the shop. Through a perfect spiral last weekend in the park. David was always clumsy, all brains and no grace. But this kid, he's got both. And he's smart, Sal. Really smart. He sees things, the way light hits a building, the structure of a bridge. He sees things like an artist or an architect. In those moments, watching him, I saw the father he would have been. I saw the legacy he hoped to leave, not in cold steel and unforgiving glass, but in the boundless future of this boy he adored. The buildings were for the city, but Leo was for him. The first crack in the blueprint, the first hairline fracture in that perfect facade, appeared on a Tuesday in early spring. The air outside was full of the city's specific promise of renewal, of things waking up, the scent of damp earth from the park, and exhaust fumes mingling in the streets. But Arthur brought a deep, penetrating chill into the shop with him. He walked in, and the usual crispness was gone. His suit was rumpled, the fine wool creased as if he'd been sitting in a vinyl waiting room chair for hours, twisting and turning. There was a faint brownish stain near the cuff of his shirt. Coffee, maybe. His tie was already loose at his throat, the knot pulled down like a man gasping for air. He sat in the chair, and the smile he gave his reflection in the mirror was a ghost, a faint twitching imitation of the real thing. I put the cape around him, the familiar ritual feeling hollow and strange, and the silence was heavy, broken only by the sharp, metallic snip-snip of my shears. The usual easy rhythm was gone. The comfortable silence we could share was replaced by a tense, humming void. "Everything all right, Arthur?" I asked, keeping my voice low and even, the way you do around a spooked horse. He stared at his reflection for a long, unnerving moment. He looked 10 years older than he had a month ago. The lines around his eyes seemed to have deepened overnight. "It's Leo," he said, his voice raspy, unfamiliar, as if it had been scraped raw. "He's sick." That was the beginning. Over the next few weeks, the story came out in painful, disjointed fragments. Each Tuesday haircut a new, darker chapter in a book I wished I could close. It started with what they thought was the flu, a stubborn bug he couldn't shake. Then the school nurse called, suggesting mono. He was tired all the time, bruised easily, his skin taking on a pale, almost translucent quality. Arthur described seeing a dark purple bruise on Leo's shin, the size of a plum, and Leo couldn't even remember bumping into anything. The captain of the soccer team, a boy who was pure kinetic energy, a blur of motion on the field, was suddenly too exhausted to climb a flight of stairs to his bedroom. Then came the endless doctor's appointments, the blood tests, the agonizing waiting for results. Arthur spoke of the medical jargon, the talk of blast cells and platelet counts, with the frustrated helplessness of a brilliant man adrift in a language he couldn't speak. Then came the word, the one that sucks all the air out of a room, that makes the world tilt on its axis. Leukemia. It hung in the air of my shop, thick and ugly, smelling of antiseptic and a terror so profound it was almost a physical presence. Aggressive, the doctor said. Acute myeloid leukemia. Words that were a punch to the gut, a cold clinical descriptor for a monster. The boy was only 15, just starting to navigate the clumsy, wonderful, terrifying world of girls, and driving permits and what he wanted to be when he grew up. And now he was in a sterile room at Mount Sinai, tethered to a clanking IV pole, fighting for his life. The treatments were brutal, a chemical warfare waged inside his own body. Arthur's face, each time I saw him, became more of a mask, a strained, rigid composure that barely concealed the screaming panic underneath. He was spending his evenings, and every spare moment at the hospital, trying to be the rock. He read to Leo, Tolkien, adventure stories, anything to transport him out of that white beeping room. He ran interference with the doctors, grilling them with questions born of late night, desperate internet searches on his laptop, the screen glowing in his dark apartment. He tried to keep David and Eleanor from completely falling apart, a task that seemed more impossible with each passing day. "They're ghosts, Sal," he told me one afternoon in late April, his eyes fixed on some distant, terrible point in the mirror, far beyond the confines of the shop. David just paces the halls. He walks from the window to the door of Leo's room, back and forth for hours like a caged animal. He wears a path in the linoleum. He can't even look at Leo for too long. It's like he's seeing a ghost already. His own son. Yesterday, a nurse offered him a cup of coffee, and he just stared at her hand like he didn't know what it was. And Eleanor, she just sits there, holding Leo's hand, crying silently. Her face is just wet all the time. She doesn't even seem to notice the tears anymore. She just hums these little tuneless lullabies, the same ones she sang to him when he was a baby. It's a horrifying sound. I feel like I'm the only one holding the whole damn thing together, the only one who can still form a coherent sentence. He was their rock. He was the godfather, the fixer, the strong one. He was Arthur Finch. It was his job. He organized meal deliveries for them, fielding calls from well-meaning but draining friends. He updated the extended family with carefully curated, optimistic reports so David and Eleanor wouldn't have to repeat the horrific details over and over. He researched alternative treatments in the dead of night, his desk lamp a solitary beacon in his silent apartment, sending articles about experimental clinics in Germany and Switzerland to the doctors, grasping at any straw, any sliver of hope he could find. He, a man of logic and order, was trying to build a fortress around a life that was dissolving like sand in water. He was trying to design a solution for a problem that had no blueprint. Then came the news that felt like a death sentence. The chemotherapy, as savage and relentless as it was, wasn't enough. The cancer was more relentless. Leo needed a bone marrow transplant. Immediately. The word remission was a distant shore they couldn't reach. A wave of frantic, desperate hope swept through their circle. A match had to be found. It was a simple matter of science, of genetics, a biological lottery. Family was tested first, of course. David and Eleanor went in, their faces etched with a desperate animal prayer. They were his parents. It was the most likely source, the most natural solution. They waited for the results. A week of suspended animation, where every ringing phone was a potential miracle or a final crushing doom. Arthur described that week as living inside a bell jar, the world outside muffled and distant, the air inside thin and unbreathable. They lived in a state of perpetual, nauseating suspense. The following Tuesday, Arthur didn't show up. 4:30 came and went. The chair sat empty, a glaring silent hole in the rhythm of my week. That was the first in 12 years of unwavering punctuality. My stomach clenched into a tight, cold knot. I knew without knowing how that something terrible had happened. An empty chair can feel louder than a scream. I found myself watching the clock, sweeping hair that wasn't there from the floor, wiping down my already gleaming counter, unable to shake a feeling of profound dread that settled over the shop like a shroud. I even called his office, something I'd never done. His secretary, a woman named Carol, who I'd spoken to once or twice, sounded strained. "He's not in, Sal? A family emergency." The words were professional, but her voice was tight with a worry that went beyond the office. He finally called late that night, long after I'd gotten home, and was sitting in my own quiet living room, the TV on but muted. His voice was hollow, a dead thing on the other end of the line, stripped of all its usual warmth and resonance. "They're not a match, Sal," he said without any preamble, the words flat and heavy. "Neither of them. Not David, not Eleanor, not even a partial match. The doctors say it's unusual, highly unusual for neither biological parent to be at least a partial, but it happens. The last two words were coated in a thick layer of disbelief, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as me, repeating a line the doctors had given him, a clinical absurdity that made no sense. The search widened into a frantic public campaign. Aunts, uncles, cousins were tested, each one a new hope followed by a new disappointment. A frantic campaign to get people to join the National Bone Marrow Registry was launched. Flyers with Leo's smiling, healthy face, a picture Arthur had taken on that fishing trip years ago, were plastered all over town, on coffee shop windows and community bulletin boards, a heartbreaking counterpoint to the pale, sick boy wasting away in the hospital bed. Nothing. Every day that passed, every negative result that came back was another grain of sand slipping through the hourglass. Leo was getting weaker. The vibrant, athletic boy in the photos on Arthur's phone was fading, becoming a fragile ghost haunted by the shadow of the boy he used to be. I saw David once during that terrible time. He stumbled into the shop, but not for a cut. He was looking for Arthur. The man was a complete wreck. The confident, easygoing partner of Finch and Geller was gone, replaced by this frayed, twitching nerve ending of a man. His eyes were wild and red-rimmed. His expensive clothes looked like he'd slept in them for a week. He smelled of stale hospital coffee and a fear so potent it was almost a physical odor. "Have you seen him, Sal?" he'd asked, his voice cracking, his hands trembling so badly he had to stuff them in his pockets. "He's not answering his phone. I think he's screening my calls. We need him. Eleanor's a mess. Leo keeps asking for him. He won't talk to me. He just asks for Arthur." He looked around my quiet shop as if the answer might be hiding in a corner, under a stack of old magazines. He looked like a man dangling over a fathomless abyss by a single thread, and the thread was Arthur. He left as abruptly as he arrived, the bell on the door jangling forlornly behind him. The next time Arthur came in, he looked like he'd been through a war. He didn't wait for me to ask. He collapsed into the chair, the cape feeling less like a garment and more like a shroud. The words just spilled out of him, a torrent of exhaustion, despair, and a strange, new tension. "They asked me to get tested," he said, staring at his own worn-out hands, which were resting, uncharacteristically still, on the cape. "David and Eleanor. They came to my apartment last night. I was trying to work, trying to keep the firm from imploding while David's gone. He hasn't been to the office in a month. They just showed up at my door. They looked like refugees, like they'd been wandering in the wilderness." He took a shaky breath, reliving it, his eyes unfocused in the mirror. "They stood in my living room, on the Persian rug Isabel and I bought in Istanbul, and Eleanor just started weeping. These horrible, ragged sounds. David tried to speak, but he couldn't get the words out. He just stood there, opening and closing his mouth. Then they were on their knees. Sal, literally on their knees on my expensive rug, begging me. You're his godfather. You're family. You love him like we do. You're the next best thing. Please, Arthur. You're our last hope. Please get tested." He shook his head, a gesture of profound, weary disbelief at the sheer theatricality of their desperation. What was I supposed to say? I'm looking at the two people I have loved most in this world, and they are completely, utterly broken. Of course, I said yes. I'd do anything for that boy. You know that. I'm going tomorrow morning. There was a sliver of something in his voice then, buried deep under the layers of exhaustion and despair. It was hope, a desperate, last-ditch lottery ticket kind of hope. But it was there. He was the hero swooping in at the 11th hour. It was the role he was born to play, the one he'd been rehearsing for his whole life as their friend, their partner, their rock. He was going to give this one last, impossible thing to the people he loved most in the world. He was going to save them all. He was going to save Leo. The following week, he walked in. It was a Tuesday, 4:30 on the dot. But it wasn't Arthur Finch. It was his ghost. The man who sat in my chair was a stranger, an effigy carved from ice. The warmth that had been his defining characteristic was gone, extinguished as if a switch had been flipped somewhere deep inside him. The easy confidence had been replaced by something brittle and cold, something terrifyingly sharp. He sat down without a word. His movements were stiff, robotic, overly precise. I put the cape around his shoulders, and the soft cotton fabric felt loud in the crushing silence. His eyes met mine in the mirror, and what I saw there made the hair on my arm stand up. It was pure, unadulterated devastation, but it was something more. It was the look of a man who had not only looked into the abyss, but had found it staring back from inside his own home, from behind the faces of everyone he loved. I started the cut in silence. There were no words. What could I possibly say? The only sound was the low hum of the clippers against the back of his neck, a sound that suddenly felt intrusive, profane. It felt like I was mowing a lawn in a graveyard. "I got the call," he said finally. His voice was flat, a dead monotone, devoid of all emotion. It was the voice of a machine reporting a catastrophic system failure. "From the head of the transplant center, Dr. Evans. He asked me to come in. This morning." He was specific. He said, "Come along, Mr. Finch." He took a breath, a dry rattling sound in his chest. I stopped the clippers. The silence rushed back in, heavy and absolute, pressing in on us. I could feel the story balanced on a razor's edge, my own razor resting forgotten on the counter. I went to his office this morning. It was all very sterile, very quiet, wood paneling and leather chairs. I sat across the desk from him, and I was preparing myself. I thought he was going to tell me I wasn't a match. Let me down gently, manage my expectations. I was already rehearsing the words I would say to David and Eleanor, how I would try to give them some kind of hope when there was none left. Arthur's eyes were locked on his own reflection, but he wasn't seeing himself. He was seeing that office. He was back in that leather chair, hearing those words again and again and again, like a recording stuck on a loop. He sat me down. He had this file in his hands, tapping it on his polished desk. Tap, tap, tap. He looked uncomfortable, pained even. He said, "Mr. Finch, I have some complicated news for you." He told me that I ran the tests twice, to be certain. He started talking about human leukocyte antigen typing, the HLA markers. He said it was a perfect match, a 10 out of 10 match, a 100% match. A breath hitched in my chest. A wave of vicarious relief washed over me, so potent it almost made me dizzy. It warred with the dread his tone was inspiring. "Arthur, that's a miracle. That's incredible. The boy is saved." His lips twisted into something that wasn't a smile. It was a scar, a horrifying grimace of pain that contorted his handsome features into something ugly. "That's what I said, Sal. Exactly what I said." I jumped up. I think I shouted. I said, "My God, that's a miracle." I was ready to run out of there, run to the hospital, find David and Eleanor, tell them the nightmare was over. But he held up a hand. He said, "Please, sit down, Mr. Finch. There's more." And the doctor, he just looked at me with these sad, tired eyes, the eyes of a man who has delivered too much bad news. He said, "It's more than a miracle, Mr. Finch. A perfect 10 out of 10 HLA match between a godparent and a godchild is, well, it's statistically impossible. The odds are so infinitesimally small as to be non-existent. We see closer matches between strangers on the National Registry. It doesn't happen. I felt a cold dread creep up my spine, a slow, icy trickle. My hand holding the clippers felt heavy as lead. I knew where this was going, but my mind refused to get there, like a horse refusing a jump it knows it can't make. The logic was simple, brutal, and undeniable. I didn't understand, Arthur continued, his voice dropping to a raw whisper that was more powerful and more terrible than any shout. I was confused. I said, "What are you telling me? Are you saying it's a mistake? That the test is wrong?" And he just looked at me. This poor man. This messenger who had to deliver the bomb. And he said the words that ended my life as I knew it. He paused, and the silence stretched, thin and taut and screaming. For a moment I thought he wouldn't be able to continue, that the words themselves were lodged in his throat like shards of glass. He said, "Mr. Finch, the probability is so high that it constitutes a medical certainty. The only way you could be a perfect 10 out of 10 match for Leo is if you shared his genetic parentage. There is no other medical or scientific explanation." He took a breath and looked me right in the eye. "You are a perfect match for Leo because you're not his godfather. You're his biological father." The words landed in the quiet of my shop like stones thrown through a stained glass window. Everything shattered. Father. Biological father. The quiet hum of the refrigerator in the back room seemed to roar in my ears. The familiar scent of talcum powder was suddenly suffocating. My own reflection in the mirror looked stupid and helpless, a slack-jawed bystander to a train wreck of epic proportions. What do you say to that? What words are there for a betrayal of that magnitude? It was a wound beyond suturing, a chasm that could never be bridged. Arthur didn't seem to need a response. He was lost in the wreckage of his own life, turning the knife in his own gut, examining the blade. 15 years, he whispered, the words barely audible, freighted with a universe of pain. Leo is 15. 15 years ago. I remember it. I had to go to a conference in Chicago, a big pitch for the Lakeside Tower project. I was gone for a week. It was the longest I'd ever been away from Isabel since we were married. I came back, and she was different, distant, jumpy. She said she missed me terribly, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. And David couldn't look me in the eye. He was overly cheerful, manically so, clapping me on the back, asking a million questions about the trip. I thought it was just stress. We were trying to land that huge contract, the one that made the firm what it is today. And Eleanor stopped coming over for our Sunday dinners for a while. She said she was having migraines. Migraines? He let out a laugh. It was a dry, horrifying sound, a sound stripped of all humor, all life. It was the sound of a man breaking apart, of sanity cracking under an impossible pressure. All the little pieces, he rasped, his voice ragged. All the little lies, all the jigsaw puzzle pieces that never quite fit. I remember now. A year after Leo was born, he had this terrible allergic reaction to strawberries. His throat swelled up. It was terrifying. I have that same allergy, a rare one. David and Eleanor don't. We all just laughed it off. He takes after his Uncle Arthur, they said. I remember finding one of Isabel's earrings, a pearl stud I had given her, in David's car once. He said she must have dropped it when they went to lunch. It was right there. It was all right there in front of my face for 15 years. And I was too stupid, too trusting, too pathologically decent to see it. My best friend, my partner, The man whose son I loved like my own because he was my own. And my wife, my Isabel. He finally looked directly at me in the mirror, and his eyes were burning. The devastation had been burned away, forged in the furnace of his shock into something else entirely. It was rage. Cold, hard, diamond pure rage. An architect's rage, precise and structural. They built their family on my back, he said, his voice like grinding stone. They stood at the hospital and called him their son, weeping on my shoulder. They let me love that boy. They let me pay for his private school. They let me set up a college fund for him that's now worth a small fortune. They let me be the doting, childless uncle, the tragic, sympathetic figure in their perfect family portrait. All while they were laughing behind my back. They used my love for him, my son, as the foundation for their lie. They used my own heart as a weapon against me. He fell silent. I slowly, carefully began to cut his hair again. My hands were shaking, but the familiar motion was the only sane thing in the room. The snip of the scissors was a tiny rhythmic anchor in a world that had come completely undone. The simple act of creating order out of chaos. What are you going to do? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The question felt impossibly small, absurdly inadequate in the face of his monumental ruin. He was silent for a long time. I could practically see the thoughts turning over in his head, clicking into place like the tumblers of a volt lock. The grief was gone. The shock was gone. What was left was a man I didn't recognize, a man remade by betrayal, sharpened into a weapon. They begged me to save him, he said. And his voice was dangerously calm, the preternatural calm at the center of a hurricane. And I will. I will walk through fire for that boy. He is my son. He has my blood in his veins, my marrow in his bones. I will not let him die. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the first real breath he seemed to have taken since he sat down. It was the breath of a man who has made a decision. But I'm going to burn their world to the ground first. They want a miracle? They'll get one. But salvation has a price. My price is the truth, all of it, not whispered in a dark room. I want it screamed from the rooftops. I'm going to make them tear down their own house, brick by brick, in front of everyone they love. A structure built on a faulty foundation cannot stand. It must be demolished. I'm an architect, Sal. I know a thing or two about demolition. The plan he laid out in the quiet of my shop was not one of simple vengeance. It was one of architectural demolition. It was surgical. It was precise. It was the cold, calculated work of a man who designed buildings, who understood that to rebuild something, you first have to demolish the old rotten structure right down to the bedrock. He wasn't going to just tell them he knew. He was going to make them tell. He was going to turn their lie into their public undoing. He went from my shop directly to the hospital. He didn't go home. He couldn't. His home wasn't his home anymore. It was a crime scene. He told me about it the next time he came in, a special appointment he'd made, his voice still holding that terrifying flat calm. He'd walked into the private waiting room where David and Eleanor were keeping their vigil. They'd looked up at him, their faces hollowed out by a mixture of hope and fear, ready to hear the bad news, the gentle letdown that he wasn't a match. They were braced for disappointment. They were not braced for him. He stood there and looked at them for a long moment, memorizing their faces in this final moment of their shared illusion. The man who had been his brother, the woman who had been his friend. He saw them for what they were, thieves who had stolen his past, his present, and his future. I'm a match, he'd said, the words falling like stones into the quiet, anxious room. The explosion of their relief was, he said, physically sickening. Eleanor burst into gut-wrenching sobs, grabbing his hands, kissing them, calling him a saint, a savior, an angel sent from God. David hugged him, a clumsy, desperate, suffocating embrace, clapping him on the back, sobbing with a gratitude that was pure poison in Arthur's veins. I knew it. I knew it. You've always been his guardian angel, Arthur. Always. I always knew you'd be the one to save him. Arthur just stood there, cold and still, as a marble statue in the center of their emotional storm. He let them exhaust their joy, let it wash over him, and leave him completely untouched. Then, when their sobs had subsided to hiccuping breaths, and they were looking at him with shining, tear-filled eyes, he spoke again. I am a perfect match, he repeated, his voice cutting through their lingering tears like a scalpel. A 10 out of 10. The doctors say it's a statistical impossibility. He paused, letting the words sink in, watching them with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a reaction. Unless, he let the word hang in the air. A loaded weapon. He watched the color drain from Eleanor's face as if a plug had been pulled. He watched the dawning, panicked confusion in David's eyes as his tired brain tried and failed to connect the dots. He was watching 15 years of deceit begin to unravel in real time, right before his eyes. Unless, Arthur continued, his voice dropping to the temperature of ice. I'm his father. He told me the silence that followed was the loudest thing he had ever heard. It was a vacuum filled with the silent screams of a 15-year-old lie being torn apart at the seams. David stumbled backwards and collapsed into a chair, as if his legs had been cut out from under him, his face a mask of slack-jawed, uncomprehending horror. Eleanor just stared, her mouth open in a silent, oh, a choked animal sound caught in her throat, her hand flying to her mouth as if to physically hold the truth in. I will save my son's life, Arthur told them, the words, my son, a deliberate, brutal, punishing blow. The procedure is being scheduled. I have already signed the consent forms. But my consent, he said, leaning in slightly, his proximity a physical threat, is conditional. He laid out his terms, each word a hammer blow on the anvil of their guilt. It wasn't enough for them to know that he knew. The lie had to be publicly executed. He demanded a family meeting, not just them. He wanted David's parents, the proud, doting grandparents. He wanted Eleanor's parents. And he wanted his wife, Isabel. They were all to be gathered in one room, the entire inner circle of the lie. And in front of everyone, David and Isabel would confess. Not Eleanor. He saw Eleanor as a co-conspirator, but a weaker one, trapped by circumstance. David and Isabel were the primary actors in this tragedy. They would tell the full story of their sordid, week-long affair 15 years ago while he was in Chicago building their shared future. They would explain, in excruciating detail, how they had conspired to pass another man's child off as their own. And then, the final turn of the screw, after the transplant, when Leo was strong enough to hear it, without his fragile heart giving out, they would sit him down, all three of them, David, Eleanor, and Arthur, and tell him the truth too. They fought it, of course, Arthur told me, as I shaved the back of his neck with the straight razor, the blade cool against his skin. His skin was cold. David wept and pleaded. He babbled about their family, about their reputation, about the shame it would bring upon his parents, about protecting Leo. Eleanor begged me not to destroy them. She kept whispering, "Don't do this to Leo, Arthur. Please don't hurt him like that." Arthur's reflection in the mirror was grim, a stone carving of a man. I told them they had destroyed themselves 15 years ago, and they had hurt Leo with every single day of this lie, with every birthday card I signed Uncle Arthur. I told them the truth was the only medicine that could save any of us now. I gave them a choice. They could have the truth and their son's life, or they could keep their secret and watch him die. The choice was theirs. There was no choice, of course. He had built the perfect trap, a cage of their own making. They were prisoners of their own history. They agreed. The confession, as he described it to me later, was a scene from a Jacobean tragedy, all hushed tones and shattering revelations. They gathered at David and Eleanor's house, a place where Arthur had spent hundreds of happy evenings, celebrating holidays and birthdays. The walls were lined with framed photos of their perfect family. Leo on a pony, Leo at his first communion, Leo with his arms around David and Eleanor, all of them smiling. Lies. Everyone. The grandparents arrived, buzzing with nervous excitement, their faces alight with joy, thinking this was a meeting to formally and joyfully celebrate the miracle donor. And Isabel, Arthur's wife, arrived looking pale and confused, summoned there by a clipped formal call from Arthur that gave no explanation, a command rather than an invitation. Arthur stood by the fireplace, a silent, avenging angel, and he made them speak. He simply nodded at David, and David, his face gray and doughy, his voice choked with a shame so thick it was almost physical, began the story. Arthur told me he didn't watch David. He couldn't bear to look at him. He watched Isabel. He saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes as David mentioned the year, the conference in Chicago. He saw the flicker turn to denial, then to panicked comprehension, then to the sickening, crumbling realization that her carefully constructed world was ending. Her eyes flew across the room and met Arthur's, and in that one eternal moment, she knew that he knew everything. She didn't weep. She didn't scream. She simply shattered in place, her whole body seeming to fold in on itself, as if her bones had turned to dust, a silent internal collapse. The grandparents' joy curdled into confusion, then to horrified disbelief, then to rage and a terrible weeping sorrow. David's mother let out a single, piercing shriek. David's father, a stern, proud man, simply stood up, walked over to his son, and slapped him hard across the face, the sound echoing in the stunned room. The beautiful family portrait they'd cherished for 15 years was revealed to be a forgery. The foundations of their lives turned to sand beneath their feet, but Arthur felt nothing. He was a surgeon cutting out a cancer. The pain was necessary. The wound had to be opened to the air to have any chance of healing. The transplant went ahead a week later. Arthur and Leo, father and son, lay in adjacent sterile rooms, connected by a truth that was about to save one of their lives and had already destroyed so many others. Arthur told me the physical pain of the procedure, the deep grinding ache in his hip bones as they harvested the marrow with long needles, was nothing, a dull inconvenience. The real pain had come before. This was just the aftermath, the cleanup. He lay there, listening to the rhythmic beep of the monitors, the only sound in his white room, and felt a strange, hollow peace. The demolition was complete. He had leveled the site. He recovered quickly, driven by a will of iron. Leo's recovery was slower, a fragile day-by-day battle against infection and rejection, but the doctors were optimistic. The transplant was a success. Arthur's marrow was grafting into his son's bones, killing the cancer, creating new, healthy blood. A new life, born from the absolute ashes of the old one. The day Leo was cleared to have more visitors, moved from the positive pressure isolation ward to a regular room, Arthur enacted the final parts of his meticulously designed plan. He had divorce papers drawn up by the most ruthless, efficient lawyer in the city. They were delivered by courier to Isabel at her parents' house on Long Island, where she had fled after the confession. There was no conversation, no final, tearful scene. There was nothing left to say. Their marriage hadn't just died. He had discovered it had been a ghost for 15 years. Signing his own copy of the papers, he felt nothing but the quiet, satisfying click of a door closing on an empty room. The next day, he called an emergency meeting of the board of Finch and Geller. He walked into the conference room he had designed, with its commanding view of the city he had helped build, laid out the facts of David's conduct with cold, legal precision, and invoked a morality clause in their partnership agreement, a clause they had written together, laughing years ago, thinking it would only ever apply to some hypothetical future scandal. He cited gross personal and professional misconduct and a catastrophic breach of fiduciary trust. It was brutal and efficient. David, his face gray and slack, didn't even put up a fight. He sat there, a broken, diminished man, as his life's work was stripped from him in front of the partners they had mentored together. Arthur bought out his shares for a fraction of their worth, the punitive price stipulated in the contract for such a breach. The following Monday, workmen arrived and, with heat guns and scrapers, peeled the vinyl letters of Engeller off the frosted glass doors of the main entrance. The firm was just Finch now. Solid, singular, unbreakable. The hardest part was Leo, the final, most painful act. Arthur waited until the boy was stronger, sitting up in bed, the color slowly, tentatively returning to his cheeks. David and Eleanor were there, as instructed. They looked like strangers to each other now, two people bound together only by a shared, corrosive shame, their personal orbits having decayed into something hostile and distant. As promised, as commanded, they told their son the truth. Arthur wasn't in the room for that. He couldn't be. He stood outside in the corridor, leaning against the sterile pale green wall, listening to the rhythmic squeak of a janitor's cart making its way down the long hall. He told me he could hear the low murmur of their voices, then a sharp, anguished cry from Leo that was cut short, a sound of pure psychic pain, then a profound, terrible silence. After an eternity that lasted about 20 minutes, the door opened. David and Eleanor walked out, their faces streaked with fresh tears. They didn't look at him. They couldn't. They just walked away, down the long antiseptic white corridor, in opposite directions, two ghosts leaving the scene of their haunting, their footsteps echoing separately. Arthur took a deep breath, straightened his tie, and went into the room. Leo was staring at the ceiling, his face pale and clammy, his eyes wide with a pain that had nothing to do with his physical recovery. He was a boy whose entire world, every memory, every family photo, every certainty he had ever known, had been rewritten in the space of an afternoon. The ground beneath him had ceased to exist. Arthur pulled the hard plastic visitor's chair to the side of the bed. He didn't speak. He just sat there, a silent, waiting presence, for an hour. Then two. The only sound was the quiet, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor, a steady counterpoint to the chaos in the room. Finally, as the sun began to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the room, Leo turned his head on the pillow and looked at him, really looked at him, with new, terrified, questioning eyes. "Is it true?" Leo asked, his voice a hoarse whisper, cracked and dry. "Yes," Arthur said, his own voice quiet, steady. "You're my—" The boy couldn't finish the sentence. The word was too foreign, too impossible, too big to fit in his mouth. "Yes," Arthur said again. They sat in silence for another hour. The city lights began to glitter outside the window, a galaxy of distant lives. "Where will I live?" Leo asked, the question small and freighted with the elemental terror of a child who has just discovered he is homeless in the most fundamental way. "Wherever you want to live," Arthur answered, his voice gentle for the first time in what felt like months. He had burned the old world down, and now he stood before this boy, with nothing but the raw, unvarnished truth, and a question. "But if you'll have me, I'd like you to come and live with me. I have a house. There's a room. It's been empty for a long time. Leo just stared at him for a long time, his gaze traveling over Arthur's face as if seeing it for the first time, searching for something. Then, almost imperceptibly, so small it was barely a movement, he nodded. That was 2 years ago. They still come in. Not at 4:30 on a Tuesday anymore. That man, that life, is gone, erased as completely as the name on the door of his firm. They come on Saturday mornings now, together. Arthur is a different man. The easy performative warmth is gone, replaced by a quiet intensity, a gravity that seems to pull the air in the room toward him. There are more gray hairs at his temples now, lines around his eyes that weren't there before, etched not by time but by trauma. He doesn't talk as much, doesn't feel the need to fill the silence. But when he looks at Leo, who now sits in the chair first, there's a fierce protective light in his eyes that is more real and more powerful than any easy smile he ever had before. Leo is quiet. He's 17 now, healthy, tall and lean. But the easy athleticism hasn't fully returned. The soccer star is gone, replaced by a more thoughtful, more watchful young man. He's got his father's eyes, Arthur's eyes, and his jawline. He reads a lot while he waits for his father's cut to be finished. Serious books, novels with worn covers. He often has a sketchbook with him, and I'll see him drawing the reflection of the bottles on the shelf, his pencil moving with a steady, precise grace. There's a fragility to him still, the shadow of what he's been through, but there's a strength too. He's a survivor. They both are. Their conversations in the chair are simple, hesitant things. School, a movie they saw, plans for the weekend. It's the careful, quiet talk of two strangers learning to become family, building something new and fragile on a foundation of scorched earth. The first few months, Arthur told me, were impossibly hard. Leo was angry, sullen, locking himself in his new room for hours. Arthur would cook elaborate meals that went uneaten. The silence in the large apartment was a constant screaming accusation, but Arthur was patient. He didn't push. He just stayed. He was just there. One night, Leo came out of his room holding his sketchbook. "I can't get the perspective right on this," he said, not looking at Arthur. And Arthur, the architect, sat with him for hours, teaching him about vanishing points and sight lines. It was the first brick. It was a start. It's still awkward and it's hesitant, but it's true. And I guess, in the end, that's what Arthur wanted. The truth, no matter the cost. I finished Leo's haircut, dusting the loose hairs from his neck with a soft brush. Arthur pays, leaving a generous tip on the counter as always. "Thanks, Sal," he says, his voice even. "See you in a few weeks, Arthur." "You too, Leo." Leo gives me a small nod, the ghost of a smile touching his lips for a second before vanishing. Then they walk out together, father and son, their shoulders not quite touching, two solitary figures stepping out of the shade of my awning and into the bright, unforgiving sunlight of the city. I watch them go, a man and a boy navigating a world they have to build from scratch. I turn back to my empty chair. I take my broom and sweep up the clippings of their hair, brown and gray, mingled together on the black and white tiles of the floor. Proof of life, proof of connection. You learn a lot about a man in this chair. Sometimes you learn more than you ever wanted to know. You see the blueprint of a life. You see the demolition. And then, if you're lucky, if you stay in business long enough, you get to see what they try to build in its place.